We shall now commence the panel discussion on Rising China and Emerging India, Impact on South Asia. May I request Dr. Sinderpal Singh, ICAS's Research Fellow, and the following panelists to take their seats at the head table, please. Ambassador Chan Heng, Professor Rajesh Basrur, Professor C. Mohan, and Mr. Kwa Chong Guan. Dr. Sinderpal Singh will moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you all for coming for this ICAS book launch book discussion. We have 4 panelists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of them to try to restrict themselves to about 10 minutes each, so that we can get more time for question and answer. Just let me quickly introduce the 4 speakers. We have on my right Ambassador Chan Heng, Singapore's High Commissioner to Bangladesh, Professor Mohan, who is Visiting Research Professor in ICAS, Professor Rajesh Basrur, who is Professor in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and Mr. Kwa Chong Guan, Senior Fellow in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. So maybe we'll start in the order stipulated here, so maybe Ambassador Chan can start first.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think the panel discussion should not just be a review of the book. The book has done its work. I think if we can, it would be interesting to see whether we can explore other ideas further with it. The relationship between China and South Asia, as Professor Muni has rightly pointed out, is sometimes a lot more distant than what is assumed to be. I take my points from some of the experience I've had of living in China for 4 or 5 years, both as the Consul General in Shanghai and then as the Chief Representative of Temasek in China. And the reaction that our Chinese friends have had. It would seem that at least historically, the relationship between China and India, which one would have thought would have been very close, is actually not that close, and the occasions of contact have not been that great. Often the contact has been referred to 2 Buddhist monks who went from China to India, one before the Tang dynasty, the Sui dynasty, another one a little later, as well as the trips of Admiral Zheng He, which was in the 1400s, when he came into the Indian Ocean and visited different parts of the Indian Ocean, including Africa. Interestingly, as curiosity in preparing for this, I looked at the timeline of both the Mauryan Empire and the Gupta Empire in India, the 2 perhaps the most well-known and the most established Indian empires in its medieval times. It did not coincide with the height of the great Chinese empires. The first of the empires was pre-Tang. It ended just before the Tang dynasty. The contact that the Tang dynasty had with the West was actually more with some of the Seleucid Empire, the leftover of Alexander the Great's general, rather than with India. The thrust of India's influence into China was that of religion, which entered and spread very widely. And indeed, in at least two of the dynasties in China that had the closest relationship with Tibet and therefore with India were both empires that were from outside of China. The first, of course, was the Mongol Empire, and the other one was the Manchu Empire. Part of it, scholars say, is because of the similarity between the Buddhism practice by the Manchus and the Mongols and that practice by the Tibetans. And that was perhaps the closest that Tibet and China really came to. And if you go to Beijing today, there is still a very lovely piece of land that for some reason Capital Land managed to get hold of, but they cannot touch a particular historical building down there. And the historical building is actually the palace of the Dalai Lama. And during his visits to China in those days, the emperor, it was Qianlong at that time, Qianlong would come and see the Dalai Lama often to both discuss the sutras and to repeat sutras with him and to understand more about Buddhism. But other than that, the relationship between China and India in particular, and by extension many parts of South Asia, was not as large. I think it's salutary that Professor Moni has reminded us just now in his introduction about the importance of South Asia now to China, where it comes to the issues that China has to face in its western borders, in Xinjiang and in Tibet, that they would probably need not necessarily assistance, but there is be some understanding with the South Asian countries for them to look at these issues. The perception of the Chinese towards South Asia and to India seem to be probably divided into those views expressed, the official views of the government. There, the expressions are of great friendship and support. State Councillor, well, he stepped down already, State Councillor Dai Mo visited India last year around this time, in the middle of January. And there he made the statement that China is filled with friendly intentions towards India. And while each of the countries have focused their attention on developing their own country, China sincerely strives to develop long-term friendly relations with China. Well, this is all the diplomatic talk that the Chinese government takes, and I think that is their official position. But when you come down and look at the views expressed by the scholars, and especially on the internet, that's quite a different issue altogether. I think the Chinese, if I can put it a little bit crudely, has a certain sense of triumphalism at this time. And they felt a little challenged, especially when the Western scholars, journalists, talked about the rise of South Asia, but India in particular, and this discomforted them. And indeed, after the economic crisis of 2009, and where a lot of the Western economies took a beating, while China seemed to have escaped that quite well, to the extent that some Chinese planners were talking about disengaging themselves from the Western economy, which was quite silly, but it was the sort of talk that was going on. They turned their attention to the comments about the rise of India, the rise of the elephant versus the dragon, and seemed to have taken some enjoyment in talking about the fact that India is still beset by many, many problems and that China was still moving ahead. Now, of course, this is chatter on the internet, and we take it seriously only to the point where people have this point of view and they take themselves quite seriously. They see it in this way. it is quite fascinating that India in particular saw the comment by the Chinese PLA that the Indian Ocean does not belong to India, a statement which received the retort from an Indian naval officer, I think his name was Commodore Basrur, who said, well, the South China Sea is not China's either. And these are the sort of views, and in last year when I was in Bangladesh, I called on the Chinese ambassador because I was interested in asking him about China's interest in Chittagong, because it has already been reported about their interest in Hambantota as well as the port in Pakistan. He said, no, this is not possible. This costs much too much money. We're not prepared to really finance it. What we're really interested in is that there is freedom of shipping in the Bay of Bengal, to which I said, well, as have many countries have the same view on freedom of shipping in the South China Sea. He did not respond to me. But China, at least, I think, sees the access to the Indian Ocean as their normal right. And why should they not be so? And the important thing, and it's pointed out in the book, is the fairly large sums of money that China has been prepared to spend in South Asia. I think it has already happened in Southeast Asia for many of our neighboring countries in ASEAN. They receive quite substantial support from China. Of course, it comes at a time when the US and Europe are really either not in the mood or not in the position to really be able to give the sort of money. And China at the present moment seems to at least have the wherewithal to pay for many of these things. At the same time, they see it as a continued enlargement of infrastructural development, because they are developing their own infrastructure quite enormously, and as Professor Muni pointed out just now, it is also the access that they have to have, and which consequently led to the view that Chittagong was going to be an important port, because if you can connect down through India and through Myanmar into Chittagong, that would be a very easy access to the sea from Yunnan province and Guangxi province. But that being said, it's still a lot of infrastructure development still to take place, and whether that can be done, the Chinese at this present moment at least don't seem to be pushing very fast ahead with that. But the Chinese have been known to play very long games, and at least for the time being, we don't see changes in the political leadership in the sense of radical different views and different political parties taking place. And so the development can proceed quite smoothly in a certain direction, and they can get away with that. But as for the South Asian interest in a resurgent China, I think the operative word down there is really resurgent. China has been there all this while. The interest was not there, but it's really because of the very large or heightened development in China, together with this sense of the military advancements that China has taken, that has alerted all our interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chan. I'll pass the floor on to Raja, 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this discussion, and let me begin by congratulating the SAS for promoting one of the most neglected areas of study in terms of the relationship between the subcontinent and China. While the subcontinent has become a lot more important in recent years, whether it is Afghanistan, whether it is Burma, that the study of the region as a collective has tended to be neglected. And I think one of the things this book does is to look at South Asia as a collective. How is it dealing with China? And I think historically, and I think both the region has been underestimated since the Second World War. But in many ways, I think while China is resurgent and China's links with the region are going to grow, South Asia's own importance, I think, for China is also going to increase. So I think we are at a cusp of something new, and I think dealing with that is going to lead to, I think, a lot more interesting research projects down the road. I just wanted to make 3 sets of points. The first one is about the context. The second one, I'll make a little bit about the text, the book itself, and then look at the prospect of where we go from here in terms of the beyond the current situation. So to come to the context, I think Professor Muni rightly pointed out, India, South Asia, the subcontinent, and China have been distant neighbors. That, in fact, probably, if you look at whole of Asia, probably the South Asians know the least about China, the familiarity with the Chinese culture. Most of the newspapers can't get the Chinese surnames right, whether it's Pakistanis who are very close, deeper than the Indian Ocean and higher than the Himalayas. But you look at the Pakistani papers, they can't get the names right. What's the surname? What's the last name? What is the first name? So the unfamiliarity is so deep. No other region in the world has such unfamiliarity with China. But I think the big impact of what's happening right now is China is no longer a distant neighbor. It is, I think, becoming probably, arguably, the most important external player in the subcontinent. I think that's a transformation that we've seen, and I think this only just begun. I mean, I think China's impact on the region is going to grow. But the central point here is that there was no interaction, is largely true, but what little interaction there was, where ideas and power actually moved from the subcontinent into China. When Buddhism spread from the subcontinent through different routes, both from land, what is now the great southern part of the Silk Road, and by sea, huge contacts between South India and southern China, and Tansen Sen has done some work. So there is a contact which existed up to 10th or 11th century, and then we saw things dissipate. And then with the British conquest of the subcontinent, power was radiating from the Raj into China. So it was actually the subcontinent, the projection of power was taking place from the subcontinent into China, or whether it was the British Raj's setting up of a provisional government in Xinjiang. We set up a little, what is it called, Kashgaria, that it was the Raj that set up Kashgaria. And if you go to, anybody goes to Kashgar, you can still see the British India's little mission out there, holding out called Chini Bhavan, whatever it was called. Second, young husbands exploits from the Raj across the Himalayas into Tibet. That was the Raj which forced open Tibet and pushed the South Asian or the subcontinental power into China. And more dramatically and more consequentially, the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars, which essentially moving trade from India, growing opium in India, selling it China, buying tea and selling it back, and Singapore was right in the middle of it all. And this opium trade was the structure around which a lot of things have happened. We see the historians and novelists are beginning to look back at it, and some of our own capitalists actually grew out of the Raj's opium wars. And I think that's something, again, a use of Indian power, Indian force. If you look at the repeated interventions by the Indian Army, Indian Armed Forces in southern China, the Boxer Rebellion in Beijing itself, the Indian troops were the first to enter Beijing. So what we've had was a power radiating from the subcontinent, led by the British, of course, into China. Today what you're seeing is the great reverse. The Chinese power is beginning to radiate into the subcontinent, where Chinese are consolidated themselves for the land frontiers, and you've seen the spectacular increase of Chinese presence in South Asia. The largest trading partner, biggest aid giver, supplier of defense commodities. So if you look at any major indicator of modern activity between states, you see China becoming the reversing, in a sense that the great reverse has taken place, and we're really at the beginning of a situation where China is going to be a dominant overwhelmingly important partner for South Asia, and not necessarily from the Himalayas, but from the south as well. That the Chinese presence in Maldives, Sri Lanka, that the Chinese naval presence is going to be something. Again, I think we've talked about it earlier. So the first point then is about the great reverse, the reverse flow of the Chinese power into South Asia. The second point I wanted to say about the book itself. I think the book, unlike most edited books, and I think the book is very well organized. There is a careful attempt at producing comparative studies within a single framework. One part of each chapter looking at the bilateral relations, giving the country perspective. The second part looking at the structure of the relationship. What are the specific constituencies that are being developed in each country and their attitude towards China, and how the balance between them works out. And finally, the prospect of where the current relationship will go. So I think to that extent, the book is a valuable compilation of different perspectives, and I think it fills an important gap. But I think looking at power, Professor Muni talked about balance of power and balance of payments. On balance of power, the central problematic we find is this. I mean, if you look at all the chapters, India has historically seen the subcontinent as an exclusive sphere of influence. Again, a notion that was derived from the Raj, that the unity of the subcontinent, no other power would be allowed to exercise influence. And the Chinese notion that, look, they got every right to develop equal relationships with the countries of South Asia. And what was a notional argument before became more consequential when China developed relations with Pakistan, initially with Nepal. But today, that the India can no longer argue that, look, it's an exclusive sphere of influence, and India is under pressure to devise a whole new strategy to deal with this new geopolitical circumstance that's around it. So I think this is a big challenge for India and how India does. As far as India's neighbors are concerned, I think they're sitting pretty. It's a nice place to be in. That you have the China card or a China option to deal with the presumed, what my Chinese friends call the Indian hegemony. Whenever they get upset with us, the phrase comes out. Indian hegemonism, I'm sure a lot of our neighbors agree with that. That Indian hegemonism needs to be, sorry.
The Chinese phrase is expansion.
The hegemon.
US hegemony.
We're a small hegemon, we're the local Americans are big hegemon. So I think I think it gives options for the India's neighbors of fairly doing without doing much, actually balancing India's power. And I think that's what we've seen where most countries of India's neighbors actually reveling in establishing a relationship with China. And I think it's exactly what India did with Soviet Union and the United States. So there are no surprises there from a classical balance of power point of view. But the question is, how does this play out? Because India itself is expanding its engagement with China. So we're not going to tell our neighbors, look, I'm going to do $100 billion of trade with China and you can't do any. I'm going to do 33% of the new power projects in India being built by the Chinese equipment, and I can't tell my neighbors that, look, don't buy Chinese power equipment. So I think so there is a divide within India. The security wallahs, the bad guys, caught in the World War of saying that, look, let's keep the Chinese out, let's build a great wall around South Asia. But the pragmatists in India are saying that, look, you've got to deal with the new power reality. There is no alternative but to come to terms with the rise of the Chinese power, and this needs a whole new policy. So I think that debate is going on in India. How this plays out, of course, is remains to be seen. The last point: where do we go from here? I think the first thing I think the first thing is how we imagine space is going to dramatically change in this part of the world. Now, we've traditionally seen China meant East Asia, South Asia was something else, and the two had really little connectivity. And I think what China has done in the last few years, actually 10, 12, 14 years now, once China launched the Go West strategy, or West Region Development Strategy in 1999, under Chiang Kai-shek, the dramatic transformation of Western China that has taken place in building infrastructure, in bringing modernization, development, road networks, pipelines, you've seen a dramatic alteration of how South Asia fits with Western China. In fact, I wish the map of the book, these two are not kept separate, but if you brought them together, you would see something very interesting. which is Lhasa is still the closest port to, for Lhasa the closest port will be Calcutta. For Kashgar and Urumqi, the closest port will be Karachi. For Kunming, the closest port is Sitwe, whatever, if they want to develop the old historic port in Sitwe. So geographically, Western China is adjacent to South Asia. And what China has done in the last few years is to do these spectacular grand projects linking Western China with South Asia, because logically the connections are down here at that building across the Karakorums. This is a spectacular project. In fact, Chinese did in the 70s, and today they're modernizing the Karakoram highway. They built the Lhasa railway line, which is going to come to the border of Nepal. They're doing the Great Pipeline on the railway line in Burma, and it is the notion that, look, human activity can change geography. I think we're in the middle of a dramatic transformation of how we understood geography and the connection that are going to be forged between South Asia and Western China are going to be dramatic. The second point I think which we need to look at is on Afghanistan, where China historically has tended to keep away. What does China do now when the Americans withdraw in 2014? Does China step in and produce that integrative effect in northwestern subcontinent? Because until now, Chinese have played essentially the Pakistan card. But as Afghanistan enters a difficult phase, of course, Muni talked about China's vulnerabilities. How does China now deal with the transformation, the unfolding situation in Afghanistan, and how does it fit into it? And the last point I wanted to make was, we're all talking about the American pivot to Asia, but is there a Chinese pivot to the West? That is, as America vacates the Middle East, and if China begins to, because its dependence on the Gulf oil is so deep, unlike the Americans where thanks to shale is going to come down, and India's own dependence is going to be dramatic. So the question is going to be, how does, if the Chinese dependence on the Middle East, what consequences does it have? Because South Asia sits in the middle, Pakistan becomes very important again. So you're going to see a whole range of new things in relation to Afghanistan. The last point is the triangular relationship between US, China, and India. And as somebody we talked about the other day, look, Indians have not endorsed the pivot, they're not criticized it. That there is an option for India still of normalizing, deepening cooperation with China, which could, of course, create complication for India's neighbors. If the Chinese feel threatened by the United States, would they change their attitude towards India? And what kind of an outcomes does it produce? So many things are possible here, but how the triangular dynamic plays out is going to have significant impact on South Asia.
I'll hand the floor to Rajesh, who I think has a PowerPoint presentation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by saying that my presentation is going to be fairly prosaic, fairly narrow, in comparison to what has come before and what I'm sure will come afterwards. Well, I'm taking off from the two major points that, the substantive points that came out of the book. One being what would be called the kind of split between Indian positive images and Indian negative images of the rise of China. And the second being the question of whether China is near or far. What I'm going to do here is basically, look at three questions. First, what exactly is the likely strategic impact of China's rising profile in South Asia? Second, the expectation among many, I think, which needs to be perhaps examined more carefully, the question being whether China will be or is becoming a major South Asian power. And third, the fear that Professor Rajaratnam mentioned, in a sense, among security wallahs in India. How real are the Indian fears of containment? And the way to handle this is basically, is to look at China's actual power or global standing as well as regional standing. Global standing first, because whatever you say, China's first commitment is not South Asia. China is an East Asian and even a potential global power in the making. So we look at China as a global power, both in economic and military terms, and then at China's influence in South Asia, both in economic and military terms. So let's begin with the military side, with the global side. And looking at the economic power of China, if you look at the very simple picture that I'm presenting here for want of time and space. Basically, if you look at China's GDP as a percentage of the US in purchasing power parity terms, then you can see that there is a steady growth from 1990, 15.7 to today, roughly 75.1%, and projected to 2050, the US to be left behind, with China exceeding it by 118.1%. So you can see a startling rate of growth here. Yet at the same time, we must be cautious in jumping to conclusions about the results of this growth, because in terms of GDP per capita, as predicted by two agencies, I took the combination of them, PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Carnegie Endowment, the actual growth in terms of percentage of China's GDP as China's GDP per capita as percentage of US GDP per capita is growing much, much slower. And even as late as 2050 will be just over a third of American per capita GDP. So that immediately sort of qualifies the notion that China is emerging as a huge power, #1 power in the making. Let's look at military power. Here we see that China's total military spending as a percentage of US spending is significantly growing, but it is again very, very far behind as of today. And although I was not able to get clear projections about what the figure would look like in 2050, it's, I think, fairly reasonable inference that in fact China will remain well behind the United States in its capacity to spend militarily, particularly because its GDP per capita is going to be much lower. In sum, we can say that China's economy is growing rapidly, but in fact is much weaker than that of the US. Second, that China's military is growing, but is much weaker than the US. And together, I think the picture that we derive from this is that China is not emerging as a superpower. Let's look at the position in South Asia. China's rising influence, economic influence. Now, only one indicator I'm using, but there are so many that one can use, but the one which is most handy also is trade. And if you look at South Asian states, I'm not using India here, but because that's about 10% today, the trade with China as a percentage of their total trade. In all the cases, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, it is growing significantly. Yet, please note also that India's percentage of trade is also growing significantly. Perhaps at a slower pace, but then that's because the Chinese have had a start from a much lower level. And in fact, Nepal's trade with India is now over half as compared to just 11 years back. On the Pakistan-India side, it's still very small, and therefore I put an asterisk just to kind of clarify one point, which is that the potential trade is actually very much larger than it is now, and it is, I think, a matter of time following the granting of MFN status that India's percentage will increase significantly. Just last week, a report coming from ICRIER says that actually today's potential is 10 times what is actually there today. So even though we may not achieve that 10 times, it's going to be moving forward much more than we can figure out from this particular set of statistics. So overall, we can say the conclusion from these simple stats is China's share is growing rapidly, and India's share is also growing significantly, most notable in Nepal and Sri Lanka, where it is much greater than that of China, and that India's potential trade with Pakistan is very high. So this is, in a sense, qualifying, the notion that the Chinese are simply moving into South Asia. Similarly, let's look at military power. Now, in one sense, quite clearly, China's military power is far outpacing that of India. And you can see that when you look at India's military spending as a percentage of China's, that from 98% in 1990, these are at constant to 2010 dollars, it is now just 34%. So I mean, there's a huge gap opening up here. Okay. But we'll come back to this and what is the significance of this. Looking at South Asian arms imports. Now, if you look at that, you will see that China is the largest exporter of arms, or China is the largest source of arms to Bangladesh and Pakistan, both around 40%. But India is the largest to Nepal at 50%, and Israel actually, surprise, surprise, is the largest with regard to Sri Lanka, not China. Nevertheless, China's role is growing. So, in effect, we can say for Bangladesh, China is the primary source, Pakistan, China is the primary source, for Nepal, India is the primary source, and Sri Lanka, Israel is the primary source, but China is close behind. So what does all this mean for China's influence in South Asia? This finally we are coming to the numbers. I think China's global power is significant but constrained. Firstly, it has a relatively low per capita GDP, which is going to remain relatively low down into the middle of the century. Second, the limited military spending capacity precisely because of this low per capita GDP. And third, a point that is rarely mentioned actually in much of the writings, and that is that China is going to be under domestic stress. Now this is something that I'm not talking much about right now, but we can talk about it when during the Q&A, and that is the compatibility of political and economic systems. Nobody knows exactly where China is going, but one thing we do know, I think, can take for granted is that the Chinese simply cannot spend the way that the Soviet Union spent during the Cold War. Let's look at China in South Asia. Clearly the rise is rapid, but there are limits. As I said, China has a hierarchy of interests. The top interest is dealing with the US, second interest dealing with Japan, and third, if you want to put it that way, and there may be an argument about this, is South Asia. Perhaps precisely because, as Professor Muniz said, it is a vulnerable underbelly. So, because of the fact that South Asia is the third in the hierarchy of interest, because of the fact that China has serious limitations in the kinds of investment it can make, by which I mean strategic investment, military and economic. These strategic investments in South Asia are actually likely to grow quite slowly. Besides, there are regional constraints. One is economic competition from India. Let us not forget that India's presence in Nepal is rising, in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan as well, and that it is going to, I'm not saying that it will, be able to beat China at that game, perhaps not for a while, but it is competitive. And as far as military competition is concerned, the Chinese have competition from both India and others in arms transfers from India, from Israel, from Russia, and from naval power, the US and India. I mentioned particularly that one thing I felt was a little low-key in the book was actually sort of the elephant in the room, the United States. That the United States, everybody thinks of it as a declining power. Some of the figures you have seen earlier show that it was not. And my point is that you cannot think of the strategic politics of the region without thinking of the major role that the United States is playing and is going to play. And in this context, the US-India linkage is particularly significant as a blockage to Chinese ambitions. And lastly, India has two distinct advantages. I think one has already been mentioned, the problem of distance. And the fact is that vis-a-vis influence with China, with India's neighbors, I can, I think fairly confidently assert that India enjoys a huge advantage in terms of geographic distance. I think whatever the neighbors might do, particularly say Sri Lanka or Nepal or Bangladesh, they are going to be very, very careful not to antagonize India by unduly encouraging a strong Chinese presence. Pakistan is an exception. I have no doubt about that, and that is because it is a nuclear weapons power and in any case is able to resist Indian hegemony. Finally, a strategic shift. Whose strategic shift am I talking about? I am talking about India's strategic shift. If you look at the history of India particularly from the 1950s till today, then you see you can divide it into two phases. One up till about 1990 and the second after about 1990. And in the first of those phases, India was clearly, not necessarily so strong, but certainly for the neighbors resembled something of a predatory hegemon, which was willing to intervene, which was willing to use its economic and even its military power, and was willing to, break up Pakistan, intervene in Sri Lanka, blockade Nepal, and so on and so forth, and bring them to their knees. If you look at a picture after 1990, the picture is completely the opposite. India's real power is actually growing, both economic and military, but its kind of proclivity for intervention is declining. In fact, you see, people arguing that why doesn't India be more active outside its immediate sphere? But India has not intervened in the places where it has been invited to intervene: Sri Lanka, Iraq, and to some extent Afghanistan. So, if we look at that way, India now presents a more attractive kind of appeal to its immediate neighbors, and that in itself makes it more competitive vis-a-vis China, given that China has a problem of strategic distance. So conclusions, the three questions that I started with: what exactly is the likely strategic impact of China's rising profile in South Asia? The answer is limited. Is China a major South Asian power, or is it going to be? The answer is no. And how real are Indian fears of containment? The answer is exaggerated. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. And then the last panelist, Mr. Kwa.
Thank you, Sinderpal. I'd like to thank one very old friend, Tan Tayong, and an old friend, Muni, for inviting me to comment on the book. Known Prof. Tan for more years than I can remember from the former days. And Prof. Muni, I think I welcomed you to the old Institute of Defense Studies on your first long visit to Singapore. Now, what this means for all of you who have reviewed books or commented on books by friends and colleagues, that it places great restraints on what you can say. So with that caveat, let me first say that I joined Mohan in saying that the 9 chapters of it are very comprehensive and substantive review of how the 6 countries of South Asia relate to China, and they provide very solid material for further analysis of the subcontinent's relation to China. The focus of all the chapters are very much on state-to-state relations of these 6 countries with China from the perspectives of mainly bilateral political, economic, and security relations. And they all generally project a fairly positive perception of China. But as the various authors and editors also note, Muni's conclusion, how 5 of these countries relate to China is in part determined by how their largest neighbor relates to China. And this is a point I think that I don't want you to emphasize in. But then I would disagree with you, Raja, that the China card presents a new option for the South Asian neighbors. I think it's more like Rajesh says. China is far away. India is right there on the doorstep. And this was brought to me very vividly on a visit to Pakistan, to Bhutan. This was a year before the king announced his desire to abdicate. And so, as you know, in Bhutan, the roads are very narrow and go winding in happy bend around the hills. And as I was going around one of the happy bends, we were almost pushed off the road and down the ravine by this long convoy of very large Indian army trucks. And the driver had to pull to the side of the road and let this convoy pass. And I looked at my guide and said, is this usual? He looked at me and says, sometimes more, sometimes less. So I said, and today, less. So if you're a Bhutanese, you know, that Indian army presence in your country must shape how you relate to that distant power of China. And I think here, Lodi's chapter on Pakistan also makes it very clear that its relations with India, especially over Kashmir, shapes how it looks at China. So we all look at Karakoram Highway today as strategic and all that. But to me, when I drove on that highway with all these beautiful Chinese decorated bridges, it's more symbolic. I mean, I got as far as Gilgit, but then the guy says, no, you can't go, this is Jimba. I says, why? Well, I was then trying to get to the border. He said, well, I can bring you to the border, but I can't guarantee I'll get you back. Get like out. I said, why? You look at all that rocks up there, they're going to go tumbling down on the road and you're not going to get back. So, to me, that highway is more a symbol of that region's old relations with China, which Pakistan today is trying to appropriate and claim that just as that part of Northwest India was China's outlet to the world in ancient times, so is Pakistan the outlet to the world for China today. But again, I'm not sure how good that is. But my point is that this sort of a relations should be further explored and developed in this book. Likewise with Afghanistan, Raja, I think actually spot on. Our Chinese colleagues will have a very difficult problem when the Americans pull out in 2014. And Heng, my good friend, can confirm when you talk to your Chinese think tank colleagues in Beijing, what do they tell you? You know, it's a big problem. Yes, we don't know how to solve it. But when push comes to shove, I think they're going to go into Afghanistan. And that will, I think, change the dynamics there. The other point about the book, which I thought could be developed more, is that how India's border dispute with China itself, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Jammu, Kashmir, and adjoining China, how do these border disputes affect Sino-Hindu relations? And as you all know, it's far away from China, but India is very real. I trekked in northern Sikkim, and the problem there is there. Every few kilometers, you see this conglomerate of army huts, Nissan huts that's built there, and not used, not occupied, but well maintained. Quite clearly, for them to, these are the bases for Indian army units when there's a crisis there. So I think there's a problem there. The other issue that is not mentioned in the book, which I thought should be developed further, is the management of waters. And I'm thinking here in particular of the Galung Brahmaputra River as an issue in China, India, Bangladesh relations here. You know, and I'll leave it at that. Finally, on Tibet. Muni, you talk about Tibet, but as a factor, but it's not mentioned. And I know you'll tell me afterwards that it's not that important or should not be that important. Tibet as a factor in China-India relations and how it affects India's neighbors. I will give you 2 examples here. In the late 1980s, when I was visiting Sikkim, I went to the biggest monastery there, the Rumtek Monastery. It was abandoned and then rebuilt by the 16th Kamapara. And when he died, there was a big issue over who was to be the next, the 17th Kamapara. And there were 2 contenders. Trini Kaya Dorje or Organ Trini Dorje. And so when I went back on later visits to Sikkim, to Gantok in 1992, there were police guards all over the Rumtek Monastery. What's happened? Oh, because of this controversy. But it's more than that. Hints that there's a Chinese hand in all of this. China is secretly supporting one of these candidates to be the 17th Kamarabar. And I think it's an issue you will have to India to live with. You may want to forget India, Tibet, but Tibetans will not forget. And I have a final example here. Last year, I think it was March, when I was in New Delhi for a conference. And our host very kindly put us up in a club. It was a member of near Lodi Park, historic park with a beautiful water. Yeah? Yes, yeah. So I stayed on the day after the conference to go and do some other business. I think with Nanyang visiting Mohan and all that. So I left at 9 o'clock in the morning. How come there are so many policemen around the whole park? In that, how's that? But I thought nothing of it. I came back at 11:30 in the little tuk-tuk. We were stopped by this policeman, and before I knew it, I was physically dragged out of the tuk-tuk. The tuk-tuk driver was shocked. What's happening? One of them grasped me on here, another here, pushed me to the back, and literally half carried me, dragged me down the road 50 meters to their temporary police post, where I was presented to the inspector. My passport was taken from me, and I was like, what's going on? Oh, you are a suspect in a police operation. What have I done? Suspect. I mean, I'm only a tourist here, see? Telephone calls, and then an assistant soup comes down. He looks at my passport, he ate with his colleagues, then he stopped. And those 3 policemen visibly carried me back to where they dumped me there. What's happening? I called up my friends, hey, can you check why is this so? All come out there. Oh, there was a very high-level Chinese delegation visiting Lodi Park, and the police got information that these Tibetans were going to infiltrate the park and launch a big protest. And unfortunately, you fitted the profile. Well, Muni, whatever you tell me about Tibet, ignoring Tibet, the Tibetans will not forget India. Thank you.